The man who changed editing is a Russian filmmaker, theorist, and professor. Lev Kuleshov was far ahead of his time when it came to analyzing filmmaking as a craft. His approach was scientific, more so than artistic, as he took the creative process seriously and aimed to understand how everything functioned. His personal studies and experiments were done after the revolution of 1917, which saw the working class overthrow capitalism and socialism was starting to be built. By the 20s, filmmaking wasn't even 30 years old, but it was enough time for an industry to be established with a formula and how films were made. Yet no one really studied the process of the creation of films, and there were no universities on the matter prior to the creation of the Moscow Film School. I won't get into the whole history of the school here in this video, but I'll cover some basic points. After the Civil War in Russia, the country was barely functioning in terms of having proper resources and supplies to have an efficient production. Don't forget, the Civil War occurred immediately after the First World War, which Russia was losing horribly. So when the working class took power and established a workers' government, and then fought and won a civil war, they were exhausted and left with limited resources. How does this concern filmmakers? Well, for one, the filmmakers in Russia could not make films. There were not enough reels for everyone to consistently produce films, and those who wanted to learn how could not utilize any part of the equipment because of this as well. So instead of making films, they took them apart. Most famously in the Moscow Film School, they received D.W. Griffith films like Intolerance and Birth of a Nation. They took apart these films and reorganized them, all through the use of the edit. The Soviets viewed filmmaking as a propaganda tool to fight capitalism, and the school would later become a proponent for the state more than it was in its early years. However, before the film industry was really solidified in the country, the perspective was still being molded, and Kuleshov was a big figure in this development. The most important experiment he did was named the Kuleshov Effect. In case some of you have not seen my other videos, I will go over exactly what this theory discovered and concluded about filmmaking. Here's Alfred Hitchcock's explanation of what the Kuleshov Effect is.
What one might call pure cinematics, the assembly of film, and how it can be changed to create a different idea. Now we have a close-up. Let me show what he sees. Let's assume he saw a woman holding a baby in her arms. Now we cut back to his reaction to what he sees, and he smiles. Now what is he as a character? He's a kindly man. He's sympathetic. Now, let's take the middle piece of film away, the woman with the child, but leave his two pieces of film as they were. Now we'll put in a piece of film of a girl in a bikini. He looks, girl in a bikini, he smiles. What is he now? The dirty old man. He's no longer the benign gentleman who loves babies. That's the difference. That's what film can do for you.
This is the simplicity of editing, but is the foundation for how exactly filmmaking works. You have a collection of images, and they all have a relationship. But it's how you edit these images which determines their relationship. Where the images go, how they were put together, determines how the audience sees them. I love using Hitchcock's example because it perfectly shows that the edit makes the same man look like two completely different people. The first time, he's a nice old man, maybe watching his family. The second time, he's a dirty old pervert. When in fact, he as a person has never changed. But it was his context around him that changed. The images that surrounded him dictated our perception of him. Kuleshov said in one of his writings, "Montage is the organization of cinematic material," meaning film editing controls how you see the material that was captured by the camera. When discussing the components of filmmaking, there are really two pieces, the image and the edit. And these two pieces have to constantly work together in order for the film to operate as it was intended by the filmmaker. So in turn, the filmmaker must understand the relationship between the two components to understand the fundamental dynamics of filmmaking. What the Kuleshov effect establishes in terms of the relationship between the image and the edit is that the edit controls how the audience perceives the images. The images in a film will always be seen in succession, never in reverse. So the order that the images go in is absolutely crucial to the filmmaker's vision. And what determines the order? The edit. The edit determines how exactly the film will be shown, the pacing, the rhythm, the duration of each image. The visual patterns are all decided by how the film is edited. The images are more responsible for the content, what the story is about. and they also assist with momentary emotional experience of the audience. Even then, the edit dictates what the audience feels, how they feel it, and how long they feel it for. Here's an example. I want to make a short sequence that shows the beauty of nature. That's the objective. There's no time limit nor guideline for how I achieve this, as long as we show the beauty that nature has. So we start with our subjects, which are going to most likely be the following: wildlife, plant life, different terrains. I'm going to put together two different sequences, and you judge how they differ. Now there was a stark difference between the two sequences. Let's go over how they're different. The first sequence is more focused on continuity, showing each image with an equal amount of runtime, really allowing the viewer to sink into the visuals and appreciate the images. There's no change in pace, so the viewer is essentially given the same thing over the course of the sequence in terms of the visual intensity. However, the second sequence builds together much differently. The beginning of the sequence is abrasive to the viewer and gives them no room to breathe. As the sequence goes along, the images are given a longer duration, easing on the intensity of the edit while simultaneously building to the resolution of the sequence. The end of the sequence is a nice sunset, which the viewer has been given a more dynamic display of nature. The beginning of the sequence has an aggressive tone, but by the end of it, the viewer feels the ease and beauty of nature. This emotional dynamic has been accomplished by using the edit differently, and in my opinion, the second sequence is better than the first. Sure, they both display a beauty of nature, but the second sequence has an actual punchline for the viewers to relate and reason with. Along with the change in rhythm, the viewer is given a change in the sequence that they notice. It has more of an impact on them and leads the viewer to see how beautiful nature is despite it being aggressive sometimes. The second sequence gives a more in-depth view of nature and isn't as one note as the first sequence. There could be an argument for the first sequence as it gives us more time to take in the beauty of each image. This is true. We do have more time to look, but it's also an extended amount of time looking at the same thing. The lifespan of these images may be a bit too long for the audience to gain something substantial from them. There's also no dynamic shift. They are all edited the same way, so the audience is not given a reason to read the images any deeper than what they are given. Here's a pretty waterfall, pretty mountains, a pretty animal, and so on. Yes, they're pretty pictures, but what's the reason for them? Why are they pretty, and why do we care? Being shown a collection of images that share themes is much different than displaying a sequence of images that have a rhythm that build to a resolution or climax. The images I used were different, yes, but the order and techniques used are really what dictates the feeling and comprehension of both sequences. I could have put any images in there or covered a different topic, but I would have achieved the same feeling because of how I edited them together. My examples would have been similar because of the pattern of editing I decided to go forward with, could be applied to any images that cover any topic. I make such an emphasis on this because there are some theorists that argue that the image plays a bigger role than the edit in their relationship. I want to point out that this is not true. A film is like a puzzle. The images are the pieces, and the edit is how the pieces fit together. The edit completely changes how the images fit together and relate to one another. The same image can be used a million different ways, and the sequence can have a million different conclusions, not because of the same image, but because of the variations in how the sequence was edited. There are many arguments that image over edit people try to make. I won't go over all of them in this video. If you have any questions on this key relationship in filmmaking, please leave a comment below. If you explain yourself well, I'll respond with my own comment, or I'll address it in a later video. Editing these images together is a lot like building patterns. Like we saw with the two different sequences, the patterns dictate how we receive information. We can be given similar images, but how they are communicated to us determines how we understand them. The editing pattern determines if we relate to the images or if we rather look at something else. Kuleshov has this example of how to utilize patterns, how to better gain the interest of the audience. Let's say you have a fence line that stretches 3 miles and you have 3 colors to paint the fence: red, green, and blue. The first idea is that you paint the first mile blue, the second mile red, and the third mile green. But then the second idea is to do something with more variety. Instead of every mile being a different color, you paint every line of fence as you go. This example is a great display of how change and variation does draw more interest. If you walked along the first fence line, you wouldn't think much of the colors changing. But the second fence line, you would take a notice to the change and variation immediately, and the fence would stand out more to you, especially if the pattern would change every mile, or more detail was added on the fence, like maybe certain shapes and letters would appear depending on the color of the line. People do not like looking at the same image for an extended period of time. They prefer to see variation and changing images. The kind of pattern we use, or how we fully utilize the edit, really determines if the audience aligns themselves with our message and can relate with what we are trying to communicate with them. At the end of the day, we want people to understand our message and hopefully enjoy the story we tell. And if we go above and beyond, people will want to improve themselves and the world because of our film. This is what editing can do. It can dictate a person's feelings to such an extreme that they feel they need to do something. We see this with advertisements and with news media all the time. People are manipulated into buying crap they don't need, or manipulated into believing something about a politician because of what the news says about them. It is not the fact that people are told to buy something or to believe something. It is all about how they are told to do so. Why do you think companies use cute animals like puppies in their commercials? I can't tell you how many Super Bowl commercials I've seen where a puppy and then a car logo pops up. The puppy has nothing to do with the car, but because you like the cute little puppy and it's chasing its tail or whatever the hell it's doing, you become emotionally invested in the images being shown. Again, it's how you show the puppy and how you sell the emotion in order to get the audience to really like the puppy. I could go on and on about commercials and how editing really dictates the viewer's perception, but I'm going to save that for another time. To circle this conversation back to Kuleshov, he really established the role of the edit and what exactly it's capable of. We owe him a great amount of responsibility for how the edit is used today. One of his students, Sergei Eisenstein, ended up being one of the most important filmmakers ever. However, there's always some kind of flaw to be discussed, and that's what I'll focus on next. Kuleshov was focused on utilizing the edit to improve the display of theater in films. He knew that with a higher comprehension of the edit, the story would be able to improve greatly, and the filmmaker would be able to display theatrical elements more directly with the audience. He explicitly stated that filmmaking elevates features of theater, specifically the perspectives of the characters in the story. Certain aspects of acting, like body language, movements, the pace of motion in a scene, can all be edited through how the information is portrayed on screen. There's no doubt that filmmaking improves theater, as the audience in a theatrical setting is subjected to a stage. Their eyes are allowed to wander. However, when watching a film, the audience is forced to see the image in front of them, whether it be a wide or close-up. They are limited to the frame that the filmmaker chooses. For those of you not aware of our position on theatrical filmmaking, we think that filmmaking should be separate from theater. To summarize, we are interested in revolutionizing the medium and progressing film to its full potential, and we think that this is without theater. We view theater and film cannot mix equally because their natures don't align. For example, theater and literature can work together because one medium is written while the other is performed, so they can play into each other by having a piece of literature played out theatrically. However, when films are made to show theater, they act as a service to theater. It upholds the theatrical elements rather than truly expressing the components of film itself. Earlier, when we said there are two components of film, the image and the edit, notice how we did not add the need for actors, nor sets, nor costumes, because we view those things as not necessary to make films. Even something like audio is not necessary, although now it's a rarity for film or a video to not have audio. Our position is that film must separate from theater, and Kuleshov did not share this view. Therefore, we view it as a flaw in his theory, and we must highlight it. Our past 3 videos go in depth on the need to separate from theater. This is all we'll cover for now. Kuleshov's view on the need for theatrical films is understanding. However, as we covered in the beginning of the video, the USSR wanted to combat Hollywood's film industry by establishing their own. So, for the sake of the state, the safe option was to make their own theatrical films that displayed the virtues of the working class, to combat the individualistic perspective coming from Hollywood productions. The Soviets saw films as a propaganda tool more than an art form. So filmmakers like Vertov, despite having a revolutionary perspective and spirit in his craft, was left as an outsider to the industry because he did not make theatrical films, nor did he make traditional documentaries. Kuleshov's editing theory led to the forefront of propaganda films that would end up being released by the Soviets during the 30s, all the way up to Stalin's death. His theory bled over to Hollywood filmmakers like Hitchcock and Kubrick, who would in their own right be massive figures in the film industry in America. Kuleshov is a figure who needs to be thoroughly studied and understood in order to gain from his perspective. As revolutionaries, we see him as one of the three most important theorists to study, along with his student Eisenstein and the outcast Vertov. All three of these filmmakers and theorists must be understood. We must understand what they have developed and grown, as well as understanding their theoretical flaws that they've made in their creative careers. These three have set the foundation to build upon, and we must continue to grow and build a revolutionary film theory. Once we have done so, and we are confident in the guidelines we have set, we can go on to start making revolutionary films.